How you guys doing today? Good. So, I love football, and if you guys are in this room, hopefully you love football as well. And it's funny because when I talk to people about football, and especially people that don't really know football, they're like, "Hi, Tim, what's football? Can you explain football to me?" And I always like saying that football is like, it's like chess, except big people are trying to hurt you. And it's especially true for me when I play football, so thank you so much. So why don't we get started? A little bit about me real quick. Again, I'm from LA, originally from Chicago. I work in LA right now for an aerospace company, and I also coach football on the side, and I'm crazy like that. So real quick, what's the problem that we're trying to talk about today? In my experience in the defense industry, I'm looking at a lot of processes. I do a lot of data and analytics and IT projects. And what I see is that in the defense industry, we're doing business the same way that we did it in the 80s, which is crazy to me. And the reasoning why is that I always get is that's just always the way we've done things. Okay? Same thing with coaching football. When I go to these clinics and I meet these coaches and I look at how they run their programs, they're doing the same drills they've been doing for years and years and years. Whether or not that's right or wrong is up for debate, but the same answer I get when I ask the questions of why are we doing this still is that's just the way we've done things. Okay. Last example, Moneyball. I love this movie, and I confess that this movie's been on replay for the last week, especially in preparation for this conference. I love the scene in the beginning when Billy Bean's sitting down with the scouts, and he's like, "What's the problem, guys?" And they're like, "Oh, we got to replace Giambi and Damon and all these other guys." And he's like, "You guys aren't looking at the problem, right?" They're still stuck in the old school mentality of, okay, we got to try and out-coach and out-scout everybody. But Billy Bean's like, well, that's not the issue here, right? And so, that's just the way that we've always done things. And that's kind of what I see when it comes to football metrics. So when we look at the existing football metrics today, I don't even want to call them metrics because they're just stats is really what they are. When you're looking at defense, you're looking at total points allowed on defense, total yards, yards per play, third down conversion percentage, turnovers, right? Very simple, straightforward stuff that you could look up on ESPN. Same thing on offense. When you look at the offensive side of the ball, it's total points, yards per play, third down conversion, quarterback rating, time of possession. The quarterback rating, I like that they came out with this new QBR rating because I think that's a new way of looking at things, right? That old rating has kind of fallen to the wayside, and I'm sure some people still talk about it and still show it, but I've done very high-level research on that new QBR, and I really like it. So, and then the forgotten team within football is the special teams, right? How do we capture the value of special teams? I'll be honest, as a football coach, special teams is the last thing on my mind. That's my confession. And, the way that we measure that is, okay, touchdown scored, yards gained, great. But how can we really assess the value of special teams? Okay, so my question is, when we're looking at trying to figure out how good a football team is, are any of these by themselves the right metric? Probably not. Okay, if you take all them together and combine them, sure, but how do you do that? Okay, so that's what I want to look at today. So before we do that, let me go and just show you the correlation of win percentage to, things like yards per game. Yards per game on offense, yards per game on defense, points per game on offense, points per game on defense. So if you look at the top, the yards per game is a very poor correlation to a team's win percentage. Okay, and by the way, we're looking at 120 or so football teams in NCAA college football this past season. At the bottom, the points per game is a much better correlation, but I think there's room for improvement there. Okay? So what's the correct metric? And basically, what's the right number? We're trying to get to one number, and that was my goal, and I kind of stumbled upon this, is how the heck do we figure out how good a football team is? And I just want one number. And how can we do it accurately, right? And so I want to try and take that and try and test it and model it and show that it is relatively accurate compared to some of the other numbers out there. And in addition to that, special teams, again, how do you value special teams? So I think the answer to this really is efficiency. Okay, so let me define efficiency real quick for you. Efficiency is trying to measure that effort to achieve some sort of purpose, right? Some sort of goal, right? How much effort does it take, right? And then metrics is really measuring that. So what I'm proposing is that we measure an offense by how many yards they need to gain to earn a single point. Okay, so my example is if you start on your own 30-yard line, you drive 70 yards to score, you earn 7 points, you get 10 yards per point. Okay, on the defensive side of the ball, same thing. Okay, you're looking at how many yards a defense forces an offense to gain to earn a single point. Okay, so a great example of that is, let's say an offense starts on their own 9-yard line, drives 90 yards to end up on the 1-yard line, and has to kick a field goal. Okay, that's 30 yards per point. If you average that over the course of a season, if my defense averaged that over the course of the season, I'd be crazy happy, okay? Because you're forcing them to kick a field goal every single time, driving 90 yards, okay? And anyone will tell you in football that driving 90 yards is pretty difficult to do. So right here, again, it's very simple math. Total yards on offense divided by total points on offense. Okay, same thing on the defensive side of the ball. Okay, so we got two numbers there that look at efficiency from an offensive and defensive standpoint. Okay, so what I've done is simply just taken the differential. I wouldn't say that this is crazy math. It's actually very straightforward. So we're looking at the yards per point differential, and that's what I've kind of called it. So again, we're looking at how many yards does it take to earn a single point. So on the left, there's a distribution of the college football teams this past season and what their yards per point differential is. Okay, so you'll notice there's teams on the far left, and they've had a terrible differential of -9. There's some really good teams on the right, and over there's actually two teams that had a yards per point differential of +12. Okay, and those two teams were Alabama and Notre Dame. On the right, you'll look at the correlation of the yards per point differential versus the win percentage. Okay, so you'll see a much stronger correlation than taking things like yards per point, or yards per game, or points per game. So what I did is I took that and looked at the top teams, according to my calculations, the top teams in college football this past regular season. Okay. So what I did is I took the differential and I also modified it with the strength of schedule, because that matters too. And from that, I'm showing you on the right the win percentage and where they ranked in the BCS. So again, this is my top 10, and then I'm showing the BCS and the AP rank on the right. So if you look there, we've got 9 out of the top 10 came up in my calculations. Side note, number 8 in the BCS was LSU. Again, at the end of the regular season, and they were number 11 in my rankings here. Okay, so again, win percentage is not part of the calculation. I'm just showing it for your benefit. So, I looked at this and I said, okay, this is pretty darn good in terms of looking at the 2012 season. Okay, but again, as a data analyst in my job, you always got to try and look and see, okay, was that a fluke or is there really a pattern, right? So I did the same thing in 2011. We looked at 2011, and I took my top 10 teams based on my calculations, showed their win percentage, showed their BCS percentage, or their BCS rank, excuse me, and we're looking at 8 out of the top 10 is sitting there. Again, win percentage is not part of my calculation. So let's talk, all this math is great, and we've come up with new numbers, wonderful. Let's say that all this is amazing. Well, what's the application? Okay, so there's a couple different things, and I'll be honest, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because this is my first time here, and I'm one of the first football topics, so any topics later on in the conference might wipe all of this away, but I'm going off of my own kind of thoughts and also ideas that I've kind of brainstormed with other people. So when you're looking at the applications, you're looking at potential impacts to coaching schemes, philosophies, even game time decisions possibly, okay? And I think that this could be like a first step towards this whole Moneyball concept, okay? And I say first step because it's really difficult, and they talked about it in the fantasy football session this morning. It's really difficult to go and isolate a single player and say, what impact does that player have, okay? But I think you can't do that until you really have one number to kind of point at, okay? So in the whole Moneyball example, they always said, okay, we need to win this many games in order to get to the playoffs, right? And so in order to win this many games, we got to have this many win percentage, and this win percentage, in order to get that, we need this many runs, and it can allow no more than this many runs, right? And so they had one number to base it off of. And in football, we don't have that number, and that's kind of where this first step plays in. So again, you want to try and have a target for yards per point differential, and I threw out a number there, 5, because it looks like if you're plus 5, then your win percentage is roughly around 65 to 70%. Okay, so from there, you can say, okay, you can set targets for your yards per point on offense and your yards per point on defense. Some of the other things you can look at is, looking at player management, okay, and managing similar to how you'd manage an investment portfolio. And I think that's what a lot of NFL teams hopefully are already doing today. Finally, changes to calculations for betting lines. That's something I threw out there because, it is a strong correlation to win percentage. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert in, betting lines and calculating betting lines or anything like that. I'm just an expert at losing money in Vegas, So real quick takeaways, and then we'll get to your questions, and you guys can shoot me. Efficiency appears to be a better measure of how good a football team is, right? And then the impact is, coaches can go and use this metric, and even front office guys can use this metric to start to change, their philosophies in offense, defense, and how they manage their team, right? Side note, I was looking at the data a little bit more last night, and we focus so much on GMs managing players, but what about coaches? And especially with football, like schemes matter, right? And so you're not just looking at a single player, you're also looking at the entire body of work of an offense or a defense or a special teams unit. So it's interesting because I looked last night, just for kicks, and I was looking around at the defensive side of the ball, and I was looking at the top 10, according to my calculations, the top 10 most efficient defenses. And what I found was there's, 2 really good teams out there that had some solid defenses. There was Rutgers and Cincinnati. There were other ones, of course. You've got the usual guys like Alabama and LSU and things like that. But I found Rutgers and the Cincinnati Bearcats had a very good defense for the past 2 years. So for the heck of it, I looked up, who their coaches were and where they are now, and one of them got, hired by the Buccaneers. And I thought that was interesting, and it's something that you can kind of look at and say, how efficient are they? Because when I looked at the usual stats like yards per game and points per game allowed, they weren't jumping off the charts, right? But when you look at it from an efficiency standpoint, they were very effective defenses. So that being said, I will take your questions.
I've got a mic back here, so we'll get you.
In your model, did you take into account anything for yards being weighted greater as you get closer to scoring position than when you're further away, and and look at situations where you have a yard on 4th and 1 is more important than on 3rd and 5?
Mm-hmm. No, because we're looking at it I was really looking at it from a whole season perspective. Yeah, it's really not meant to go and look at the micro, the in-game and everything. You can certainly start pointing and saying that, okay, based on this, based on how we do, over the course, let's say you're halfway through the season, you can kind of start to say, okay, based on what we've done so far, this is kind of where we stand, and here's our 3rd down conversion rate and stuff like that. And based on that, we should probably make this optimal decision, okay? But in terms of weighting the yards, no, we didn't do that because it's really an aggregate.
Yeah, looking at it as you described it, as points per yard, essentially, wouldn't factors such as red zone offense and defense, and also turnovers play a large role in that? Because if a defense is very good in the red zone, they're only giving up 3 points. If an offense is very good in the red zone, they're getting 7 for the yards they gain. And again, the turnovers. If you only have to go 40 yards for a touchdown, that number is going to be much higher than if you have to go 80 or 90.
Right. If you look at it in an aggregate, all those turnovers are incorporated into that number, because an offense is going to gain, let's say, 50 yards, and then they're going to throw a pick, right? And so that 50 yards that they've just gained is wasted, right? And so in the long run, that all averages out and increases that defense's yards per point allowed.
Creating turnovers, eliminating turnovers, being good in the red zone, not and defending
Absolutely,
well
yeah.
in the red zone.
That'll boost these numbers up. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask a similar question to him regarding starting field position, because say your offense has a turnover-heavy defense. If you start in field goal range, move forward 10 feet, and kick a field goal, you're going to have a great points per yard, but you didn't do anything. You went 3 and out. So
If you're looking over the long run, there's certain situations like that where you're going to look at in-game, one drive you went 10 and out and you had to kick a field goal when you had great starting field position. But I think in the long run, all that averages out. And that's why I didn't look at game by game.
I mean, I was just wondering because it would average out to an extent, but an extremely turnover-heavy defense as opposed to a defense that never gets turnovers, that's going to have an impact.
Yeah, I think for those two types of teams, the number might actually be very similar, right? Because if you have a good defense that doesn't get a lot of turnovers, but they force, they're kind of a keep everything in front of you kind of defense, and it's like, we'll bend, not break kind of a thing, right? It's like teams will get yards on them, but they may not get points on them. And I think that's kind of what Notre Dame's defense was like, if I remember correctly, this past season, right? They were kind of a bend but don't break. They'd give up, a handful of points. They'd give up, a bunch of yards, and so their efficiency was off the charts, right? And then on the flip side of it, if you've got a turnover-heavy defense, right, it's like teams will drive and then they'll just get a turnover, right?
We'll get it back.
I left you guys too much time to ask questions here. Jeez.
I was wondering if you did any of these correlations for the NFL teams and if it was the same accuracy as for college football.
I did a handful for the NFL teams. I didn't want to dive too much into it because, again, they talked about it earlier this morning, sample size. We're looking at college football and we're looking at 120 teams, and it's like I can quickly get that data. For NFL teams, we're looking at 32, and it's not quite as good, especially when there's 16 games.
I had a question. Did you factor in at all the strength of the opponent's defense, where it ranked? When you talk about Rutgers, they had a high-impact tackler, and Kasheem Green is a linebacker, but they don't play in the SEC. So you see Notre Dame, and you saw what happened to them when they played Alabama in the national championship.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering if you took any of that into consideration.
I didn't show it here, but there is a strength of schedule modifier with that differential. Yeah, because that was key, because you've got teams like, was it Kent State that went 11-2? Something like that, right? And it's like they might look good here, but you also got to modify it and say, if we're looking at what the best team is in college football, then you can't just say, okay, it's Kent State or whatnot, right? I totally agree with you. Yep.
All right, Tim, we got one more question, and you can get off the hot seat.
Okay, thank you.
Will you please pass this down? Thanks. Dramatic.
Did you look at all at the predictive value of efficiency? Is efficiency correlated from one year to the next, or is it just sort of, an indication, or does it just sort of say the team was good this year, but I guess what I'm trying to say is if a team's good this year in efficiency, does that necessarily mean they'll be good next year?
That's an interesting question. I'll be honest, I didn't look at that. I think that's going to be really hard to predict, especially if there's, depending on what level. In the NFL, there's a lot of turnover. In college football, there's hopefully not as much turnover. So I think it might be a better predictor in college football than NFL. But again, that's really hard to say because, you know, you bring in one new coach and schemes change and, you know, throw everything out the window, right?
All right, this has been Tim Chow with the Identifying a New Metric
Thank
for
you so
Football
much.
Efficiency.